Samuel Briggs had always been the kind of man people trusted without needing to think twice. He was calm, soft-spoken, and always willing to help a neighbor. For years, his ranch sat quietly at the edge of town, surrounded by tall grass that moved like soft waves when the wind passed through. People liked the peaceful feeling his land gave whenever they drove by, and Samuel liked it that way, quiet, predictable, and steady. But everything changed one warm evening in early summer. It started with little things. Samuel began staying out on his land long after the sun went down. His truck headlights were often seen shining across the fields until midnight. Neighbors thought he was fixing a fence or checking the animals, but soon they realized it was something more. They heard the sound of metal being dragged across the ground. Sometimes there was the loud echo of tools hitting something heavy. These noises became more frequent each night. At first, people ignored it. Everyone knew ranchers had their own way of doing things. Maybe Samuel was improving the barn or repairing old equipment. But when a delivery truck showed up one morning carrying large wooden crates, people grew curious. The crates were heavy, and the delivery men could barely move them. Still, Samuel signed the papers politely, thanked them, and carefully stored the crates inside a locked shed. Later that afternoon, 2 neighbors walked by and tried to peek inside, but the windows were covered. When they asked Samuel what he was working on, he only smiled politely and said it was something important. He didn't say anything more, and the neighbors didn't ask again, but the mystery spread quickly through the town. By the end of the week, almost everyone was talking. Some thought Samuel was building something new to expand his ranch. Others whispered that he had found something valuable buried under his land. A few even joked that he was creating a new machine, but the truth was that no one knew anything for sure. And Samuel told no one. The person most worried was Clara Jensen, Samuel's closest friend and neighbor. Clara had known Samuel since they were children. She trusted him, but even she noticed how different he had become. He looked tired, his clothes were dusty, and he rarely smiled now. One evening, after hearing another loud noise from his property, she finally decided to talk to him. She walked over to the ranch just as the sun was setting. The air smelled like fresh hay, but there was also a faint smell of burning metal. Clara found Samuel behind the barn, hammering a large piece of metal onto something covered with a cloth. He didn't even notice her until she called his name. "Samuel? What is going on? You're working yourself too hard." Samuel paused, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and gave her a tired smile. "I'm fine, Clara. Just finishing something." Clara looked at the covered object. She couldn't see much, but it was big. Too big for a normal ranch project. "What are you building? You're scaring people. You know, everyone hears the noises at night. They're worried." "It's nothing dangerous," Samuel said quickly. "I promise." Clara stepped closer and spoke gently. "Samuel, please, don't do that. If you're hiding something, it will only make things worse. Let someone help you." Her voice was soft, but full of concern. She wasn't trying to stop him from working, she just wanted to understand. Samuel was normally open with her about everything. But this time, he shook his head slowly. "I can't explain it yet," he said. "But you have to trust me." Clara sighed, feeling more confused than before. She wanted to push him for answers, but the look in his eyes told her he had already made up his mind. Whatever he was doing, he believed it was necessary. She didn't want to argue, so she left quietly, hoping Samuel would change his mind and share the truth soon. But he didn't. Instead, Samuel became even more secretive. Every evening, he carried tools into the covered shed. Bright lights glowed through gaps in the walls until late at night, making his ranch look unusual and unfamiliar. Smoke rose from the chimney of the shed, forming thin gray clouds above his land. People passing by felt uneasy, wondering what could create such lights and smoke. When they asked him, Samuel simply said he was almost done. Soon after, the sheriff of the town, Mr. Parker, decided to check on him. The sheriff knew Samuel well and didn't want to trouble him, But he also had a responsibility to keep the town safe. So one afternoon, he drove up to the ranch, parked near the barn, and walked over to where Samuel was working. Samuel was kneeling beside a long metal structure, tightening bolts. He stood up when he saw the sheriff. "Sheriff Parker," he said, trying to smile. "What brings you here?" "I'm just checking in," the sheriff replied kindly. "People are talking. They hear noises and see lights. You know how small towns are. They worry quickly." "I know," Samuel admitted, looking down. "But I promise, everything I'm doing is safe." The sheriff looked at the covered structure and then back at Samuel. "Can you tell me what it is?" Samuel hesitated. "Not yet. I need a little more time." Sheriff Parker crossed his arms gently. "You're not breaking any laws, Samuel. But when a man starts acting differently, and the whole town starts worrying, it's my job to make sure nothing is going wrong." Samuel nodded respectfully. "I understand. But please trust me. When I'm ready, I'll explain everything." The sheriff studied him for a moment. Samuel's eyes looked tired but calm, not wild or angry. Whatever he was building didn't seem to frighten him. After a long pause, the sheriff nodded. "All right," he said. "But don't shut people out too long. They care about you." Samuel thanked him. But the moment the sheriff left, he went back to work with the same quiet determination. Days turned into another week. The strange activity at Samuel's ranch grew more noticeable. People started gathering outside small shops, whispering and guessing. Some said Samuel had lost his mind. Others said he was preparing for something big. Children were told not to wander too close to his land. Everyone was curious and nervous at the same time. Clara felt the pressure too. People kept asking her what she knew, since she was the closest to Samuel, but she had nothing to tell them. And the more she thought about Samuel's quiet, worried expression, the more unsettled she felt. She tried again to talk to him, but each time, he gently pushed her away with the same words. "Trust me, Clara. Please." But trust was becoming harder for her. Not because she believed Samuel was dangerous, but because he was acting like a man racing against time. Someone who had no room for rest or doubt, someone carrying a heavy secret. One night, Clara stood by her window and watched the faint lights glowing from Samuel's ranch. The lights blinked on and off like a strange signal in the distance. The sound of metal echoed through the quiet night air. It all felt unusual, mysterious, and completely out of place in their normally calm town. The next morning, rumors grew even stronger. People gathered in small groups outside the local cafe, discussing what should be done. Some said the sheriff should stop Samuel. Others said he must be planning something helpful but was too stressed to speak about it. Nobody knew the truth, and the uncertainty made everyone restless. By now, the whole town was watching Samuel. But Samuel wasn't watching them. He was focused only on his project, working as if the clock was ticking, as if something was coming, something he hadn't shared with anyone yet. And although Clara had begged him softly, "Please, don't do that," Samuel had already decided he would finish what he started. Even if the entire town worried about him, he believed they would understand later. He hoped they would forgive him. But for now, Samuel continued working alone, holding on to a truth he wasn't ready to reveal. Samuel woke up earlier than usual the next morning, even before the first light touched the sky. The air was cool, and a thin mist covered the fields around his ranch. Most people in town were still asleep, but Samuel could not afford to rest. He had too much to finish. Every day now felt like it slipped through his fingers too quickly. There were moments when he wished he could explain everything to everyone, but something inside him kept saying it wasn't the right time. Not yet. He drank a quick cup of coffee, grabbed his tools, and walked straight to the shed. The building looked different now, almost like it had grown fuller and heavier with secrets. The inside was filled with metal frames, long wooden beams, and sheets of thick steel stacked against the wall. Blueprints covered his work table, each marked with new calculations he had made late at night. He looked at the progress he had made and took a deep breath. He was close. But close wasn't enough. not for what he feared might happen. By the time the sun rose, Samuel was already tightening bolts and fitting panels together. He moved quickly, almost mechanically, his mind focused only on the structure in front of him. He didn't hear the birds outside, or notice the bright light filling the shed. The only sounds he paid attention to were the clang of metal, the hum of the drill, and the soft creaking of wood forming into place. His world had become small and narrow, centered around this single work. But while Samuel worked in silence, the town outside felt anything but silent about him. People had grown more anxious after seeing the sheriff's visit. Some assumed Samuel must be doing something important but private. Others jumped to the opposite conclusion, guessing that something was seriously wrong. They pointed out the strange glow from his property at night, the smoke that drifted above the trees, and the unusual deliveries he continued to receive. Even the local cafe became a place where Samuel's name was spoken more than the weather. Inside the cafe, a group of older men sat around their usual table near the window. They leaned in close, talking in low but restless voices. "Mark my words," one said, stirring his coffee. "No one works that hard on something simple." Another shook his head. "He's always been a good man. Maybe he just wants some privacy." "Then why the secrecy?" a third argued. "Why can't he tell us what he's building?" People in the cafe nodded. The questions didn't end, they only multiplied. Meanwhile, Clara spent most of the morning trying to calm her own worries. She had told herself that Samuel must have a reason, a real reason, for what he was doing. But even she couldn't deny the odd feeling in her chest whenever she thought about their last conversation. He had looked tired and stressed, almost like someone carrying a heavy fear he couldn't share. By noon, Clara finally decided she couldn't sit quietly anymore. She grabbed her jacket and walked toward Samuel's ranch again. She hoped maybe he would be in a better mood today, maybe he would tell her something, anything, that could help her understand. When she arrived, she found Samuel outside, moving a long metal piece across the yard. He looked exhausted, and the sun had turned his face slightly red. Clara approached slowly. "Samuel," she called gently. He looked up, wiped his hands on his dusty jeans, and tried to smile. "Clara, what brings you here?" "You know why I'm here," she replied softly. "I can't stop worrying. Everyone's talking, and I wish you'd tell me what you're doing." Samuel looked away, his jaw tightening for a moment. He didn't want Clara to carry the same fear he carried. He didn't want anyone to panic before he finished. So he shook his head lightly. "I can't explain yet," he said, "but I promise you it's for the good of everyone." Clara sighed. "Everyone? What does that even mean, Samuel? You're working day and night. You're not sleeping, and you're hiding something from your own friends." Samuel opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't form. He wanted to tell her everything, but something made him step back. "I just need time," he said quietly. "Please." Clara looked at him with a mix of frustration and sadness. She didn't want to argue. She didn't want to push him away, but she felt like she was already losing him to some unknown worry. "Then promise me one thing," she said softly. "Promise me you're not putting yourself in danger." Samuel paused. He couldn't lie. He wasn't trying to put himself in danger, but the truth was that his project came with risks. Heavy materials, deep digging, machinery, it was exhausting work. So instead of giving a false promise, he simply said, "I'm being careful. I'll be okay." Clara nodded slowly, though she wasn't convinced. She left quietly again, hoping he'd reach out once he finished. But Samuel never paused long enough to reach out. That afternoon, more deliveries arrived at the ranch, large pipes, thick cables, and sealed containers. A few children passing by on bicycles stopped to watch. They whispered among themselves, trying to guess the purpose of all the strange equipment. Some adults stood nearby too, pretending to tie their shoes or check their phones, just to get a peek. When Samuel noticed them, he didn't say anything. He unloaded the items calmly and carried them into the shed, one by one. His silence only made the townspeople more uneasy. Eventually, someone suggested calling the sheriff again. The idea spread quickly, and by evening, Sheriff Parker returned to the ranch. This time, he seemed more serious. He found Samuel inside the shed, working over a large blueprint. The sheriff stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the metal beams cast long shadows on the floor. "Samuel," he said firmly. Samuel looked up. "Sheriff Parker." The sheriff stepped inside, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar structure. "I think it's time you talk to me. People are scared. They're worried something might go wrong." Samuel set down his tool slowly. "Nothing will go wrong. I'm being very careful." "That's not enough," the sheriff insisted. "I'm responsible for this town. I need to know what you're doing." Samuel hesitated. His heart pounded slightly faster. He didn't want to argue, but he also wasn't ready to reveal everything. Not until he was sure he was correct about what was coming. "Please trust me," he said again, his voice calm but tired. "I'm almost finished. When the time is right, I will show everyone. I promise." The sheriff studied him closely. Samuel didn't look dangerous or out of control. He looked worn out, yes, but steady. Whatever he was building, he believed in it deeply. After a long moment, the sheriff sighed. "All right, Samuel. But be careful. And know that if anything seems unsafe, I'll have to step in." Samuel nodded respectfully. "I understand." The sheriff left, but his visit only added more fuel to the town's worries. By sunset, new rumors were spreading, rumors about what Samuel's mysterious project might mean. People spoke louder, more urgently. Some believed Samuel was preparing for a disaster. Some thought he was building something powerful. Others thought he had discovered something unusual underground. No matter the guesses, the uncertainty made everyone restless. Meanwhile, Samuel worked through the night again. His hands were sore, his back ached, and his eyes felt heavy, but he kept going. He couldn't stop now. Not when every hour mattered. Bright light glowed through the cracks of the shed, painting strange shapes across the field. Smoke rose into the dark sky in thin white lines. The ranch, once quiet and ordinary, now looked like a place hiding a secret too big for anyone to understand. Clara watched from her porch again, her heart heavy. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that he had a good reason. But with each passing day, the distance between them felt wider. Samuel, however, didn't notice the distance he was creating. He didn't notice the whispers spreading through town. He didn't even notice the worry building inside Clara's eyes. All he could see was the structure slowly taking shape, the project he had no choice but to finish, even if the entire town asked him to stop. And even though he had heard Clara whisper, "Please, don't do that," he knew he had to continue. Because deep in his heart, Samuel believed something was coming, and he believed he was the only one preparing for it. The storm arrived earlier than anyone expected. It began as a soft wind rolling over the hills, brushing lightly against the town's rooftops. But by late afternoon, dark clouds gathered in the sky like a heavy blanket, spreading wider and darker until the whole town seemed to fall under a shadow. People looked up, surprised by how quickly the weather had changed. No one had heard a forecast about a storm. But then again, storms didn't always follow rules. Samuel stood outside his shed, staring at the sky for a long moment. He knew this was not the disaster he feared, but it was another warning, another reminder that nature often acted without asking permission. He tightened his grip on the wrench he was holding. He had lost count of how many nights he had worked without rest. The structure in his shed was nearly complete now, but nearly wasn't good enough. He needed to finish by morning. As the wind grew stronger, Samuel hurried inside the shed and checked every part of his project. Metal beams were in place. The ceiling had been reinforced, and the thick underground walls had finally cured solid. He ran his hand across the surface of a steel panel, feeling its cold strength beneath his fingertips. Only a few more adjustments and his work would be done. He could sense the pressure building not just from the storm outside, but from the weight of keeping the truth hidden for so long. Every hour that passed made it harder for him to stay calm. He wanted to tell Clara. He wanted to tell the sheriff, the townspeople, everyone. But fear kept him silent. the fear that they would not believe him until it was too late. When the first drops of rain began tapping against the roof of the shed, Samuel made a decision. He stepped away from his work, wiped the sweat from his brow, and reached for his notebook. With a shaky breath, he wrote 30 small notes, one for each family in the town. Each note was short, simple, and urgent. "Come to my ranch tomorrow morning. It is important." He placed the notes in envelopes and sealed them. The storm outside was growing louder, but he didn't care. He grabbed his coat, stepped into the rain, and delivered each letter, door to door. By the time he returned to his ranch, his clothes were soaked, but his heart felt strangely lighter. At least now, they would come. And when they came, he would finally tell them everything. When morning arrived, the storm had passed, leaving the air cool and fresh. The sky was clear, with no sign of the heavy clouds from the night before. Birds hopped on fences, shaking raindrops from their feathers. It looked like a peaceful day, something that made the townspeople even more confused when they found Samuel's note on their doorstep. One by one, families gathered outside their homes, holding the small envelope and reading the message. Some were curious, some were annoyed, and some were genuinely concerned. But despite the uncertainty, they all remembered the same thing. Samuel had never been a liar, nor a man who joked about important matters. If he asked the entire town to meet him, it must be serious. Clara was the first one to arrive at the ranch. She had barely slept, worrying about Samuel and staring at his letter for half the night. She hurried across the fields, her heart beating fast. When she reached the entrance, she saw Samuel standing outside the shed, waiting quietly. "Samuel," Clara said breathlessly, "what is going on? Why did you ask everyone to come?" Samuel opened his mouth to speak, but before he could answer, more people began arriving. The sheriff's truck rolled into the yard. Farmers, store owners, school teachers, and children walked in small groups, whispering among themselves. Soon, almost the entire town stood in front of Samuel, staring at him with uncertain eyes. Samuel felt the weight of their silence. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Thank you for coming," he began softly. "I know many of you are confused. And I know I have worried you with my late work and all the deliveries. But today, I want to show you the truth." The townspeople looked at one another. Some crossed their arms. Some leaned in, listening closely. Clara stood near Samuel, watching him with quiet concern. Samuel led them toward the shed. The doors were closed, and for a moment, everyone held their breath as he reached for the handles. Then, with a slow pull, he opened the doors wide. A deep silence fell over the crowd. Inside the shed stood a large entrance, an opening leading underground. Metal stairs descended into a wide chamber below, lit by bright lamps. The walls were strong, made of reinforced steel and thick concrete. The underground space looked large enough to fit the entire town. There were benches, shelves of supplies, water containers, air vents, and thick safety doors. It wasn't a strange machine. It wasn't dangerous. It was an underground shelter. Clara covered her mouth with her hand, stunned. The sheriff stepped forward, his eyes wide. People whispered loudly now. Surprised and confused, Samuel raised his voice slightly so everyone could hear. "This is what I've been building. I've been working for weeks to complete it. I didn't tell you because I knew you would question me. And I didn't have time to explain when there was still so much work to do." The sheriff frowned slightly. "A shelter? But why, Samuel? Why would we need something like this?" Samuel walked over to the table inside the shed where his notebooks and maps were laid out. He picked up one of the old maps and held it up. "Last month, while checking the south field, I noticed a deep crack in the ground. It wasn't normal. So I started looking at old land studies and geological reports. Some of them mentioned unstable ground in this region that could shift under pressure. I kept digging into the information, and I realized something important. The land beneath the valley has been weakening for years. A major landslide could happen any time." A murmur of unease passed through the crowd. Samuel continued, "If the ground collapses, It could destroy the farmlands, the riverbank, maybe even our homes. I didn't want to alarm the town before I had a solution, so I began building this shelter somewhere safe where everyone could stay if the land ever gave way. People looked down at the ground, their expressions softening. Clara's eyes watered slightly, not out of fear, but out of the heavy relief that Samuel had been trying to help all along. "You should have told us," someone in the crowd said. "I wanted to," Samuel replied gently. "But I was afraid you wouldn't believe me. And if I tried to explain, I would lose too much time. I didn't want to risk waiting." Clara stepped forward, her voice quiet but steady. "Samuel, you should have trusted us, but I understand why you didn't." Her words eased some of the tension in the air. Samuel nodded gratefully. "I'm not asking for praise. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want you to know that everything I did, the long nights, the secrecy, it was all to protect the town." The sheriff approached the edge of the opening and looked down into the shelter again. His face softened as he took in the details, the careful structure, the reinforced walls, the neatly arranged supplies. "You built this on your own?" he asked with quiet disbelief. Samuel nodded. "Yes, every piece." For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound came from the soft breeze blowing through the fields. Then finally, the sheriff turned to the town. "Well, I think it's clear Samuel wasn't acting out of harm. He was preparing for something he believed was coming." The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding, some whispering to each other. Clara stepped closer to Samuel. "Why invite us today? Is something going to happen?" Samuel hesitated for a moment. "I think the land may shift soon. The storm last night shook the ground more than usual. I don't know when exactly, but I felt I couldn't keep this to myself anymore." People exchanged worried glances. For the first time, they understood the urgency in Samuel's eyes. He had not been acting strange for no reason. He had been racing against time. Samuel looked around at the faces before him. "I didn't want to frighten the town. I just wanted to be ready. And now, we are." The crowd slowly began to understand, their fear turning into quiet respect. Samuel's hard work, his sleepless nights, his secrecy, it all made sense now. He hadn't ignored their warnings. He had simply chosen to protect them in the only way he knew. And even though Clara had once begged him softly, "Please, don't do that," she now realized that if Samuel had listened, the town might not be safe when the danger truly arrived. After Samuel showed the underground shelter to the whole town, a strange quietness settled over the group standing outside his shed. No one spoke for a long moment. People simply stood there, processing everything they had seen and heard. The truth felt heavy but comforting at the same time. Samuel hadn't been trying to cause fear or trouble, he had been trying to save them. Slowly, the townspeople began to walk down into the shelter, exploring it more closely. They touched the walls, examined the storage shelves, and inspected the sturdy benches. Some whispered to each other in low voices, still amazed. Others remained silent, unsure of what to say. Clara stayed close to Samuel, watching him with soft eyes. She could see the exhaustion on his face, the sleepless nights, the long hours of work, the weight of carrying such a big secret alone. She felt a rush of guilt remembering how she had begged him to stop. She had believed he was making a mistake, but she now understood he had been carrying a burden too heavy for one person. The sheriff approached Samuel and gave him a thoughtful look. "You did all this with your own hands," he said quietly. "Most people don't work this hard unless they truly believe in something." Samuel nodded, not out of pride, but out of honest sincerity. "I just wanted everyone to have a safe place," he replied. "I couldn't ignore the signs. I knew something was wrong underground, and I didn't want to wait for others to notice it." The sheriff sighed. "Well, you may have saved us more than we know." After an hour of exploring the shelter, families slowly began to head home. But their steps were slower this time, their minds filled with new thoughts. They weren't whispering rumors anymore. They were whispering respect, concern, and a deep sense of surprise. Samuel had changed in their eyes, not the strange rancher acting alone, but a man who cared more than anyone realized. That night, Samuel finally allowed himself to rest. For weeks, he had pushed himself far beyond what he thought he could manage. But now that the truth was out and the shelter was ready, he felt a calmness he hadn't felt in a long time. He slept deeply, knowing he had done everything within his power. The next morning arrived peacefully. But beneath the peaceful surface, something unusual was happening underground. It began with a soft rumble barely noticeable. The ground trembled just enough for a few people to look up from their breakfast tables in confusion. The rumble faded quickly, leaving everyone unsure if they had imagined it. By noon, the shaking grew stronger. Windows rattled. A few objects fell from shelves. Birds in the trees took off all at once, flying away in a sudden wave. The air seemed to vibrate, with a quiet warning. Clara ran outside, her heart pounding. She looked toward the mountains at the edge of town and felt her stomach twist. A thin line of dust was rising into the air. The ground was shifting. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her phone, called everyone she could, and shouted the same sentence again and again. "Go to Samuel's ranch, now." Within minutes, people were running through streets, calling out to their neighbors, helping elderly residents walk quickly, lifting children into their arms, and guiding families toward the ranch. Cars drove fast but carefully along the road leading to Samuel's property. Samuel himself was already at the shelter entrance, opening the heavy doors wide. When he felt the stronger trembles beneath his feet, his heart dropped. He had hoped he would be wrong, hoped the disaster wouldn't come, but now the truth was clear. The land was finally giving way. As the first families reached the ranch, Samuel helped them down the stairs into the shelter. "Stay calm," he said gently. "There's plenty of room. You'll be safe inside." Clara arrived next, slightly out of breath. "Samuel, it's happening. The ground near the river is cracking." Samuel nodded. "Get everyone inside. We don't have much time." More people arrived, some crying, some trembling, some trying to stay strong for others. Samuel helped every single person, one by one, guiding them down into the shelter. His voice stayed steady, his hands firm and reassuring. He did not show fear, even though he felt the ground shaking harder now. When almost the entire town had gathered inside, Samuel looked around outside one last time. A small group of late arrivals was running down the hill. He waved for them to hurry, and they reached him just as a loud crack echoed through the valley. The earth shook violently, dust flew into the air. A deep roar rolled across the land as the hillside began to shift. Samuel rushed inside the shelter and closed the heavy metal doors behind him. The lock slid into place with a deep, solid sound. Inside, the townspeople huddled together, holding on to family members and whispering soft prayers or words of comfort. The shaking grew louder. It felt as if the entire world above them was rumbling. The lights flickered, then steadied. People gasped softly but remained calm when they saw Samuel standing among them, his expression determined and steady. "It's all right," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This place is strong. It will hold." Minutes felt like hours as the underground shelter absorbed the vibrations. Dust fell from the ceiling in tiny sprinkles, but the structure remained solid. The air vents worked perfectly. The lamps glowed steadily. After some time, the shaking weakened. The roaring grew quieter. And finally, after what felt like a very long and frightening wait, the earth became still again. Someone whispered, "Is it over?" Samuel listened carefully, then nodded. "I think the worst has passed." People let out breaths they didn't realize they had been holding. Some hugged each other tightly. Some cried softly out of relief. Children clung to their parents' hands. Clara walked over to Samuel, her eyes shining with emotion. "You saved us," she whispered. "If you hadn't built this shelter, I don't want to imagine what might have happened." Samuel looked down for a moment, humbled. "I only did what I thought was right." The sheriff approached too, placing a firm hand on Samuel's shoulder. "You didn't just think it was right," he said. "You acted. That's the difference." After waiting a little longer to make sure everything outside was stable, the sheriff and 2 volunteers carefully opened the shelter door. Sunlight streamed in, but the sight outside made everyone gasp. The hillside near the South Valley had collapsed completely. Large sections of land had shifted downward, leaving deep cracks in the earth. The riverbed had changed direction slightly. Fences and farm structures had been destroyed, but the town itself where the home stood was untouched. Only one reason explained why the town was safe. Samuel's shelter had brought them underground just in time. One by one, people climbed out of the shelter into the sunlight. They walked slowly, taking in the damage around them. Some cried softly at the sight of ruined fields, but then turned and looked at the untouched houses behind them. The realization settled in their hearts like a warm truth. They were alive because someone cared enough to prepare. People gathered around Samuel. They thanked him deeply, some shaking his hand, some hugging him, some simply standing before him with grateful tears in their eyes. Samuel accepted their words quietly, still overwhelmed by all the emotion around him. Clara stepped closer and spoke softly so only he could hear. "I'm sorry I doubted you," she said. "I just didn't understand. But now I know you were trying to protect us all." Samuel smiled gently. "You were only worried. That means you care. I don't blame you." From that day on, Samuel became something more than a rancher. He became a symbol of courage, quiet strength, and the importance of doing the right thing even when people misunderstand you. Teachers told children his story for years to come. Families often walked past his ranch and remembered the night they found safety beneath the ground. And whenever the town gathered for events or festivals, people would greet Samuel with warm smiles, respect, and gratitude. The story spread far beyond the small town, the story of a man everyone begged to stop, a man who heard them say, "Please, don't do that," yet continued anyway, because he believed it would save lives. And he was right. Sometimes, true bravery is silent. Sometimes, a hero is someone who works alone, unseen, believing in something no one else can see. Samuel never asked for praise. He only smiled and said, "I just did what I had to do." But the town never forgot. They never forgot the rancher who saved them all.